Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Leach, and thank you for joining us today for MaMa's LiveTalks, Take 10. Today, we are going to have a lively discussion on voting as the country grapples with race relations in 2020. We'd like to thank you for tuning in, and we encourage everybody to ask questions during this process. If you're tuning in on Facebook Live, you can ask our panelists any questions in the comments that you have, and we will be happy to ask those to them for them to answer in real time. Unfortunately, today, MaMa's website is having technical problems, so you are not able to watch this live stream on the MaMa's website, but you can watch it here on Facebook Live, so please spread the word if you can. And later it will be embedded on our website for you to watch for the future in case you have to miss it. So let everyone know. Without further ado, we're excited to introduce, we have the host of Ellis Conversations, and I'd like to start with Jamil Ellis today. Welcome, Jamil.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
There's my dad. Hello, welcome. I'm so excited about having this conversation tonight in this moment. There's so much going on, and there's this hope that right now we are bearing witness to history and to positive movement in the struggle to break down systemic racism. And this is a core theme in the podcast that I started with my father, Ellis Conversations, and we started that last October. And so I'm happy to be inviting other people into the conversation at this important moment. But before we get more into the podcast and conversation, let's do a quick round of introductions. Again, my name is Jamil Ellis. In my day job, I'm a CTO at Bright Power, and it's a company whose mission is to combat climate change. But in addition to that, at work and it's outside of work, I spend a good portion of my time working to increase diversity in technology, and in specific in climate technology as well. I've also been involved at the crossroads of creativity and technology, spend a bit of time doing creative work, and I serve on the board of Culture Hub, which is at that crossroads. And I also create content like the podcast we're going to be talking about today. And I've been working with that with my dad. So Dad, can you give a short bio for yourself?
Okay. In addition to my most important job of being the father of Jamil and Jelani, I retired in 2017 after 24 years as a United States Magistrate judge in the Southern District of New York. Prior to that, I served 17 years as a staff attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and at points during that period of time headed the employment program and the poverty and justice program. I have taught going back to 1984, a course involving race, justice, and law, and more recently have expanded that to include other issues of individuals that have been oppressed by systemic problems within American society.
Thank you, Dad. And then also with us today, I have Debra Cleaver, who is someone with me. Debra actually went to high school together at Stuyvesant High School in New York City, and has been kept in touch, and I love all the work she does. Debra, can you give us a short intro to yourself?
Yes, I am a serial founder in the voter turnout space. And I've been working at the intersection of technology and democracy, specifically identifying roadblocks to voter participation and clearing them, because Americans don't need to be convinced to vote, they need to be able to vote. And I currently run an organization called VoteAmerica, which is focused specifically on helping people vote by mail in 2020.
Thank you, Debra. So where do we start here? So a lot going on. I think it's been exhausting. There have been a lot of different conversations going on, besides the conversations I have on the podcast. And I think to start off, I'm going to quote Kamau Bell. He came out on this on Juneteenth. He had this quote on his Twitter. He said, "Just so we're clear, white people, firing Aunt Jemima, giving us Juneteenth off, are not front lines defeating white supremacy and dismantling structural and institutional racism. Better schools, a just criminal justice system, access to healthcare was more we were thinking. And I think for me, that just got to the heart of what I was feeling at the time, because, you know, it's overwhelming. I love that people are talking about it and engaging in conversation, but the idea of making significant change in systemic racism it can be overwhelming. You know, when you think about the fact that, you know, the police brutality you see is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to over-policing the prison industrial, you know, all the prison to pipeline. It's just mass incarceration. It's just a part of it is the brutality you see. That is a small part of the brutality that systemic racism is brought upon our society. And, you know, to defeat that, sustained action is necessary, and that's weighty. And how do you come to that problem? And so part of that was the conversation that me and my dad started having, and the impetus for the podcast. So the first question I was going to want to talk about is like why we even did this podcast. You know, it's about, you know, we'll take a historical context of race and law, but what, you know, why, you know, what are the reasons we did it? So Dad, I don't know if you teach a class at CUNY Law, related in vein, longer format for law students, but kind of walk me through the kind of your thought process on how we approach this problem, because a lot of it is, I think, the impetus of like why, like the reasoning and the genesis of why we were doing this podcast.
Okay, well, first of all, I think the important thing is the quote you read is spot on. And that is that I think people need to remember to keep their eyes on the prize. You hear people saying things like up in Albany, they're trying to fix the police problem, and other people saying, well, now that you've reached your goal, then you need to stop protesting. Well, that is the nub of what you want to do in teaching a class, to let people know and to try to figure out what the goal is. And part of figuring out what the goal is to try to figure out what the problems are. And so there are two themes that have predominated in the courses that I've taught. One is the importance of history, and that is understanding history, understanding how the systems came into place and how they've been perpetuated over the years. And so it's important to understand that a lot of the things that people seem outraged about aren't inventions of the 21st century or even the 20th century, that these are things that go back to the founding of the nation, and that when you look at the way things were structured, it gives you some idea of what it is that people are trying to achieve in those structures. And the second theme is the role of law. It turns out that some people see law as just that arbiter, that justice being blind. But the reality is that when you look at the history of the country, law is not an actor that's pulled screaming and kicking into the fray, but an active participant, often leading the way in terms of limiting the rights of those who've been oppressed and making sure that they won't have redress if they happen to seek redress in the courts. So that was the impetus of the course. And frankly, I think what happened is I said this so much around my sons that they said, you know, you ought to say that to other people. I'm not sure that was a defensive mechanism or what, but it is true that I have a tendency to, when issues come up, to say, you know, that's not new. People were doing that back in the day. And you think it's bad now, but you need to understand the people who came before and how their lives were remarkably more depressing and difficult than yours.
And I appreciate, I've learned a lot in the context of this. I've never gotten to take your class, so it's been interesting. And we really did start from the beginning. Well, we started from a beginning. We started from the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, which isn't the beginning, but it is definitely a key part to the story, and the contradictions inherent that you see people grappling with. I now see memes about, very clear memes about everyone who was signing the Declaration who had slaves, the people are cognizant of that, but I don't think we often reflect on that history for various reasons. And so it's been interesting to do that. We've talked about housing segregation, redlining. You'd be surprised how many people don't understand how deep segregation goes and how much the government and law has been a willing participant in setting up those structures that exist to separate us. We talked about poverty and discrimination, eugenics, stolen history. We'd actually watched Watchmen together and inspired well before everyone got very excited about Tulsa very recently. We did an episode on stolen history, and we were just being, I had not realized, even myself, how much stolen history there was, how much Tulsa is just one small example of something that repeatedly has happened time and time, like during that time and in other times, just the brutality that has gone on that we don't learn about. So if you haven't learned it, Tulsa is just an example. Take a look. There's, I think it was interesting. I mean, even Daddy, you found some stuff. We were doing stuff on lynchings, and you found that the place that the county, the parish you were from in Louisiana was the leader. The parish was the leader in lynchings in the country at some point. As I remember.
Only second place.
Oh, it's only second place. That's just the parish in Louisiana that my dad that was born in. It was second in the country in lynchings, and I think so. I'm not gonna, this is just to get you interested in listening to more of the podcast. But some of that history is very interesting to absorb and and so we talked about that, and we did a long bit on criminal justice and on voting rights. We spent a lot of time talking about the history of how people have tried to disenfranchise over time. I mean, there's and all up to the VRA and the gutting of the VRA, which is recent news. They gutted the VRA. When is Shelby, Dad? It's
2013.
2013. They just gutted the VRA Act, and this idea that voting is safe. And if you've been following the news, no, your vote's not safe. There are people that actively are trying to disenfranchise. So it's an interesting history that I learned a lot from. And it's funny, when we started the podcast, we were supposed to make evergreen episodes. Like, this is just, it's historical context. So it's not supposed to be rooted in current events. The sad part is you do a podcast and you have an element about an unarmed Black man being killed by the police. I mean, that's unfortunately the reality is that how you can't place that in time. So it'll become relevant at some point. Sometimes in bigger ways than others. So we plan it to be evergreen, and we concentrated on those main topics, and it's been interesting. And I'm particularly excited about the episode that we did recently with Debra on voting rights, talking about what's going on right now, because it is, as I said, the active elements that want to disenfranchise and voting should be a right. There's people there that are actively trying to get in the way of that. So what I'd like to do now is I want to play a clip, just a quick clip from the podcast, get to give you a taste of the conversation. So we have an audio clip to share, and this is a little bit from Ellis Conversations. Well, welcome to another episode of Ellis Conversations. I'm your co-host, Jamil Ellis, and with me remotely is my father, retired federal magistrate judge, the Honorable Ronald Ellis. Say hello, Dad.
Hello to our listeners.
You can imagine my surprise when earlier this week, and I can't believe that was this week, and that's what I mean about time, moving so slowly, to see the President of the United States suddenly say that having people vote by mail would lead to, I don't think he used as big a word as unprecedented fraud, but I believe he said that voting by mail would lead to voter fraud. And it's on its face such a patently absurd statement that I was not sure how to proceed with it, but Twitter decided to tag it or to put up some sort of disclaimer that this was not a factually correct statement. And then all hell has broken loose since then. But I guess as the head of VoteAmerica, I would just like to say for the record, for anyone who might have doubts, that is emphatically an untrue statement. even the idea that we have voter fraud that is perpetrated by individual voters is an emphatically untrue statement. You are more likely to get struck by lightning twice.
Where I wanted to start the conversation connected to all that was recently there was, during the pandemic, this crazy, all that goes on, there was a case that I hadn't seen a Supreme Court case get as much attention that connected so much of this about elections and it's about pandemic around the Wisconsin case. So a lot of people got really fired up about what happened. We didn't get a chance to talk about it. So I asked my dad to tell me a little, like, what happened in this? And with that, are the courts going to save us in 2020? Are they going to save us?
The short answer is no. The Purcell case, which per curiam decisions don't go into detail, but Purcell involved basically an attempt by certain elements in Arizona to limit immigration. They had basically a voter proof of citizenship requirement. What the court did is it credited the idea that voter fraud is an issue.
Okay. So that was just a short clip from the episode, and the main point I wanted to get at, which is super relevant in light of primaries that went on yesterday. And I tried to have, one voting station in Kentucky. I want to talk about voter fraud. So about this myth of voter fraud and what that's about. So Debra, is voter fraud real? Should we all be concerned?
You are more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to commit voter fraud. I think the actual statistic is that you are more likely to be struck by lightning twice. But I'm 100% certain that you are more likely to be struck by lightning once than you are to commit in-person voter fraud. So I would say no, that voter fraud perpetrated by individuals is not a real thing. That is a work of fiction. There is excessive voter fraud at the state level, however. Maybe excessive is strong. When voter fraud exists, it's generally government officials who are doing things such as not mailing vote-by-mail ballots in time, trying to close polls while people are still trying to vote, or as happened in Florida in 2000, finding boxes of ballots in the middle of the night. But no, individuals do not commit voter fraud.
So what is all this talk? I mean, Dad, we talked about what's the historical context? I mean, it seems we seem to hear a lot about the specter of, there's gonna be lots of fake votes. We should be afraid. Our rights our democracy's in danger.
Well, I think the ultimate point to be made is that there were a number of fictions that were put forth basically to prevent people from voting or to justify restrictions on voting. As it turns out, the idea of voter IDs goes back to the post-Reconstruction era, when in order to reassert their power over the voting process, a number of kinds of things were put in place in order to limit the ability of the individuals who were supposedly freed to exercise their franchise. I mean, I think it's actually it's a pretty good indicator that if you look at what people oppose the most, it's an indicator of what's important to do something about. Frankly, I think the kind of work that Debra is doing is hopefully going to counterbalance some of this. I mean, I think in one of our episodes on voting rights, I said, maybe what we should do is we should follow up on Shelby County by making all of any change in voting, they should do some metric to see what the impact is going to be on certain groups. So it's such an important right that the idea that you would change it and you would affect large masses of individuals in participating in the body politic seems to me contrary. And so I think this idea of voter fraud, I can't really talk about it legally because because there's no factual foundation for it, except for the fact that the Supreme Court does seem to say it's a legitimate interest on the part of states.
Important. So I'm wondering, if we could take a moment, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about VoteAmerica. You guys' focus and mission, the chaos in 2020. I mean, stuff, as we kind of alluded to, there's been things since we did the podcast, but just take a moment to tell us a little bit about what you guys are focused on.
Sure. So we are a brand new organization started by people who have been involved in many political cycles. When we started in the halcyon days of January 2020, we were primarily worried about hostile foreign interference and the fact that we knew that we're going into this presidential election knowing that Russia intends to interfere with it, which is definitely like a new challenge for us as Americans. It turned out that they did interfere with 2016, but we didn't know. So at the time, that's what we were concerned with. And we knew then that the 2020 election would be defined by chaos. And we thought that would be sufficient chaos, just knowing that there would be hostile foreign interference. And then in February, we saw the partisan hijacking of the DOJ, which is concerning. If you work in voter turnout, the president was impeached. I mean, I think we've all forgotten about that. It seems so long ago. And the Iowa caucus melted down due to some like subpar technology. So we're like, oh, this is quite chaotic. And then March saw a global pandemic, at which point we were like, wow, this is going to be exceptionally chaotic. And we started to make a list of all the things that could go wrong in November and potential solutions for them. And it didn't take very long to figure out that the November election will be held primarily by mail because people will be unwilling or unable to vote in person. And we've seen that play out both in good ways and bad ways in all the Democratic primaries that have happened. We're seeing record numbers of people apply for vote by mail in Georgia. 33 times as many people signed up for vote by mail in this primary as in the 2016 primary. So that's a huge increase. Like I was like, we'll probably see twice as many people try to vote by mail this year. No, we're seeing 33 times, which is great because it means they're not voting in person. But it also meant that we saw tens of thousands of ballots that didn't go out in time. So people tried to vote in person, only the records show that they'd received their vote by mail ballot. So they were forced to, vote on provisional ballots, which creates a whole set of problems. So the good, people are voting by mail or trying to. Also good, we're just seeing record high interest in voting this year. The bad would be that election officials just seem to be really surprised that elections are happening, just super surprised. I'll keep picking on Georgia. There were just not enough provisional ballots at polling places. And they were closing polling places the day before the election without letting anyone know. So people were going to the wrong polling place, which means they would need to vote a provisional ballot, but then there were no provisional ballots. And then, Kentucky pulled something exceptionally cute where they got it down to one polling place for 600,000 people, which would mean that polling place would need to process 400 votes a minute to be able to keep up with the expected volume. So when they tried to close the polls at 6 p.m., there were still hundreds of people waiting to vote. What a time to be alive, Jamil.
Yes. Well, I hope that the time is about change, though. It has been energizing watching people, watching protests in the street, being a part of that. I took my daughter out and she's 6, and it's, I hope that I have some amount of hope. It's a little bit, I feel like some things we've seen before. So it's hard to be very hopeful. I feel sometimes, but because actually what I want to do is, our latest episode was about the right to protest, actually, and we talked a lot about how much your rights are protected, and kind of like part of the continue of that, which was quite interesting, pretty much, especially after the great photo op incident outside the church in DC. It's like, well, how protected are we, as the president says, shoot the protesters, those thugs out there. So that was the last episode. So I wanted to play, I had a short video clip from our last episode on Right to Protest that I wanted to show. And so take a look. So this is that.
And I wanted to at least sort of bring this together in terms of what turned out to be the letter from a Birmingham jail. What people often don't see is the letter that precipitated the letter from a Birmingham jail. And that was a letter, an open letter to Dr. King from basically all of the religious leaders in and around the Birmingham. It was the Episcopal leader, it was the bishop from the Archdiocese, Temple Emmanuel. Every religious denomination had gotten together, and basically they said to King that the series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders, we recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. It's always untimely.
It's never the right time.
It's never the right time. It says, we further strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. Now, of course, that's a prescription for nothing happening.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, the local leaders are the people who are basically ensuring that there won't be any change.
That's right.
And I think we should probably put up the letter from Birmingham jail, but I just wanted to read one little excerpt, and it says, this is Dr. King. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom.
So I think it's a for me, when I think about hope and change in the moment, I love that we were playing that you found that clip that to read to me, Dad, because I hadn't remembered that. I feel like I've read it, but to come back, I pulled it out and I read it again after that. And part of my fear in some of this is that, people are energized, they're up because they saw those 8 minutes 46 seconds, so there's something to do. But the real, to go to Kamau Bell's statement there, there's more, there's a lot, and we've been here before, and there's a lot of work to do. And when it comes down to us having to figure the sustained action, and when you have to give up certain things, the status quo, you may have to give up certain things in the status quo that have given other people opportunities and at the expense of others, and you must change that equation. That is difficult work to do. And are people ready to do that work? Is it going to extend beyond this? And so I don't know. So I appreciate it. And I guess, I don't know if anyone wants to say anything. I
wanted to jump in real quick, Jamil, and just say we have about 15 minutes left. And I wanted to encourage, this is an incredible conversation. I'm really enjoying it. And I wanted to encourage anyone who's watching on Facebook Live, we're still encouraging you to ask questions. Just ask in the comments we'll be happy to ask our panelists. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, definitely want to have questions. So we'll do one more question for you, Dad. I won't say how old you were back in the civil rights era, but you're actually, your birthday's coming up. My dad's birthday's July 4th. Judge on July 4th. You've seen some of this before. Is this different? This is a question I know people like literally stop you and they're like, is this different? Is it different? Is this the...
Well, let me just point out one thing, for example, to sort of give you my scope on history. One of the go-to tactics when there were slave revolts was the imposition of curfews. Does that sound familiar? And curfews have the effect, for example, of criminalizing the protest. That is, you can now be in trouble for doing nothing except exercising your rights. And you saw that happening here. Yep. So a lot of people who are in power think like the people in the past. They are interested in order, not justice. And they also think small. It's like, it's true that Black lives matter, but as pointed out in the quote you read, Black lives matter not just when it comes to police violence, they matter when it comes to Black babies who don't get health care and other Blacks who don't get health care. It matters when there's discrimination in housing and health care. It matters when toxic wastes are put in certain neighborhoods. It means that if we're going to value the people and make sure that the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a real thing, we've got to have a sea change in the idea. And I think, we talk about the law in the Supreme Court. We know about Plessy and we know about Dred Scott, but as I think becomes evident, I think one of the most insidious things that the court's ever done is to impose upon those who've been oppressed and victimized a requirement to prove the intent of something which oppresses them. This is something that we need to change. There's now talk about qualified immunity, which basically prevents police officers from being sued when they do things that are, a layperson would say, well, how can that not be a problem? And part of that is the Supreme Court put in place a mechanism, which is basically a catch-22, because one of the things you have to prove is that there's a case that clearly shows that what the police officer did was unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court has said you don't have to reach that case. You don't have to reach that issue. So we're not getting decisions in which courts are saying this is unconstitutional behavior. So qualified immunity, you should see coming up as an issue. We'll see how they handle that. The Republicans have proposed a bill which doesn't really address the heart of the matter. And so I think this whole idea that segregation, violence, housing, healthcare, if you can't prove that you've been victimized intentionally, then you don't have a right to change it. And I think the voting rights is one of those things. We need to see how they're going to deal with that. If we're not willing as a nation to decide that if a large segment of our society is unable, regardless of the intent, to be able to access all the riches in this country, then I don't know that we're going to be able to go forward. That whether it's truth or reconciliation or something. One of the things that King said in his I Have a Dream speech is that America had given the Negro a bad check and had come back marked insufficient funds. Well, I think a measure of what we'll be able to do is whether or not we allocate funds to change the American structure of oppression and violence. And so ask me again in 60 days and I'll see if we've done anything other than change symbols.
All right.
That actually leads really well into one of the questions. People are wondering, when everyone moves forward, for instance, the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013, but what helped it get passed in the first place? Was it protests that made that happen? And anyone can weigh in on that question.
Let me. This is one of my pet peeves. So let me just say, I think that there's a tendency to look at this as either or, when it really is all and everything. When you're facing a problem of such magnitude, it requires a full-pronged approach. Protests, laws, money. I mean, there are lots of things that need to be done because the opposition is going to do everything in their power to restrict those rights. And so I think the protests were essential, but I don't think we should be getting into debates about whether we need to protest, and if we don't protest, and the lawyers aren't going fast enough. What the civil rights movement showed us is that it was important that there were people who had bail money to get some of the protesters out of jail. It was important that there were lawyers who would go to court. And it was important for those protesters to be on live TV and to show people what was really happening. So yes, it is important, but those of us who want to have the arc of history bend toward justice need to have everybody pulling on it to get it in the right direction.
Yeah, I think people
protests are a significant part of that.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, including myself, are the what can you do, and because you know certain things work and you know certain things got the voting rights. There's a collection of things that have helped progress, and you're like, how can I be a part of this? And as we discussed, that there is a lot you can do, because there is a lot to do. The one thing you can't do is you cannot sit on the side. You cannot not participate in the voting in government. You cannot not participate. If you don't participate, you are part of the problem. You have said that status quo is fine. But there are lots of small ways that everyone can contribute to, bending the arc of justice in the right direction. And I think that's important, because I think, especially with the epidemic, I know there's a lot of frustration about how can I, not everyone has the funds to commit. Not everyone can be right out there fighting the curfews and being out there to exercise our rights. But there's many, many things to do. And any time justice that we've gone in the right direction, it's been because there are many people contributing in many different ways. Ryan, you have another question for us?
Yeah, I do have another question. So this one talks about how those in power manipulate language to get out of the consequences, and those who are vulnerable have no real knowledge of the ways that language is being used against them in law. And they're basically asking, why does that matter? How can we address this?
Well, let me take a quick stab at it. I know I tend to talk long, but I think sometimes what we need to do is to just call them out on it. I mean, I think, frankly, if we publish some of the dissents that or portions of the dissent, I think we go a long way toward people understanding what's really happening. And it's important that people understand that the people are using language which is not clearly racist or sexist. This idea that it's neutral. And sometimes if you're neutral, it means that you're really putting your thumb on the scale. And I think we just need to do a better job of calling it out when it happens.
Yeah, I agree. And I think people, calling it out is a big thing. And I know that's a lot of what people have talked about allies doing now. I think there are people that do understand what language, the power of language. I think it's been one of the things we've been following is even the language in Wikipedia. And if you look it up, there's a group of people that have changed it. It used to be the Tulsa riots when it really was a massacre. And those things have changed. There's a group of people that are documenting trying to understand that knowledge and wording matters. I know I'm very careful when I talk about the protests. I call them protests because that's what they are. And you know, I think certain people are hip to it. It doesn't hurt to repeat it. And it's not always about the legal language. It's about the language that we use to tell stories and to tell the narrative. There's a great article about passive voice that I read, and it was talking about how, like, when they talk about protesters or violence, they would use passive voice to kind of eliminate that there's a subject doing an action. A police officer is making a brutality, is performing the act. They'd be like, a reporter got shot, and like, we don't know what happened. So, you know, call out the language when you see it. Be specific about what's going on. Don't, you know, there's no, and I think more and more people do understand that, and they understand the power of how you, of narrative and how you talk about things. So I think, as I said, that's my point. I think we make progress on it, and we just need to keep, you know, be cognizant of it. You know, be critical of what you hear and the stories you hear.
Just as a number of people in my class have taken to calling it the criminal legal system because there's no justice in the system.
And just to piggyback on what Jamil said about describing the protest as protest, I would agree. And I also think it's important to point out that the police are rioting in the streets. It's absolutely not civilians, but the only word to describe what the police are doing right now is rioting. At least that's how I describe it. It catches everyone, but the difference between a peaceful protest and a riot is the like police behavior. And we've seen time and time again that the police are rioting. They put on riot gear to meet peaceful protesters who they then attack physically for exercising their lawful right to protest.
I try not to hear too much news, but I love the chant. It's like, we're not, you know, there's a riot here. Why are you in riot gear? And it's like, this is, there's an escalation, and there's a reason why they all have military equipment and feel the need to use it and whatnot. Not a good reason, but yeah, I agree. And I think that turning the narrative into where, and the truth of it is very important.
If you have a hammer, every problem is a nail.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Anything else for us, Ryan?
Yeah, I have one final question. And then after this, I think we can wrap up so you can all include your final thoughts in your response. But this is from Catherine Wohl, and it's for Debra. She asks, since elections are controlled at the state level, what can we do in our own states to ensure that votes are not being suppressed? And I think that's interesting because I know that states like California have implemented some of these reforms, but then we still saw like long lines in Los Angeles. And that was something that was interesting for me to see, if you can address that.
I mean, I would say, I think the most important thing that states can do, and the demand that citizens should be making, is states should proactively mail ballots to registered voters this year for the November election. It reduces costs, it increases turnout. We know there are going to be issues at the polls, and I think that's a demand that we can make of states. As California demonstrated, it could be done via a statewide executive order, which people then sued over. So instead we did it legislatively, but that is a demand that we can make of our states, that they mail out the ballots. The other demand is that ballots that are postmarked by Election Day should be considered timely, not ballots that are received by Election Day, because voters have no control over how quickly mail delivery is. And it doesn't make sense that people who vote by mail have a deadline that is significantly shorter than people who vote in person. So those would be the two changes I think we should be demanding of our lawmakers. We pay for election administration, so we have the right to demand that our tax dollars are used in an efficient way. And we have plenty of time to get those changes. I mean, there's, 140 days until the election.
Great point. Any final thoughts from you, Jamil, or Judge Ellis?
I'm going to say one of the important things at the state level is to always, I feel we broke record talking about voting so much, but voting locally too. I mean, the only way we get some of the changes, and we did it here in New York State, is like in the last state election, we put a couple of more people who part of their platforms was to make voting easier. And so you can't complain about the value of your vote unless you're if you're not using it, and the very first thing is like, are the people you're electing, do they care about voting? Are they pushing forward? There's a couple different there's established ways to get people to vote automatically, AVR, all these things that to get people to get people involved in the system and have them exercise their right. But you need to care about every election, not just the presidential election, and locally be involved and be aware of what's going on and how to engage in our society, in our politics, in our democracy. Dad, any last words?
Yeah, any last words?
Well, I think we all agree that one of the most important things is voting. And I think what some people don't realize and what they need to do is to realize that what it is that the people that you're voting for actually do. That is, you won't realize the importance of what you're doing unless you realize what those people control. And it turns out that a lot of the local things are more important to people's everyday lives. People were voting about who's going to be on the Supreme Court, but, the Supreme Court takes maybe 60 cases a year. And most of what happens in people's lives, what textbooks their kids read in school, what parks are preserved, are done locally. And people could get involved in local politics that don't even involve them going into big elections. So all politics is local, and it does appear to me that if you could just make a list of what you think is important, and then figure out who has something to do with it, that's a project that you could undertake.
Amazing. Thank you all three so much. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. This was a huge topic that you all tackled, and we only had 45 minutes, and I think you did an excellent job, and it's such a privilege to be able to participate. Anyone who's listening, thank you for your questions. And also, I believe you can follow Ellis Conversations on iTunes. Yeah, they can download it there. I'm sure many other places. And you can also follow VoteAmerica on Facebook and social media. Yes?
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll be back next week on Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. with another live talk from La Mama. Thank you so much.